On this Monday night, fresh optimism in the development of a COVID-19 vaccine. The potential new shot in the arm.
We need to stay strong and hang in there a few more months.
Why it could be significant and what's still unknown. COVID-19 cases are climbing across Canada. The calls for tougher crackdowns and lockdowns, and the confusing messaging in Ontario and BC. Joe Biden's pandemic plea.
It doesn't matter who you voted for. We can save tens of thousands of lives.
What the next commander-in-chief wants all Americans to start doing now. And a father's grief, the tragic twist in a Canadian veteran's mission to find his son's final resting place.
Global National with Donna Friesen.
Good evening and thanks for joining us. I am not in the studio at the moment because I've just returned from covering the presidential election in the U.S. and I'm quarantining for the next 2 weeks. So there is no crew with me and the set looks a bit rudimentary, but we're going to carry on with the news. And we begin tonight with what could be a first step out of all the restrictions we are living under. A vaccine developed by the companies Pfizer and BioNTech has shown early promise. Preliminary results show it is more than 90% effective at protecting people from COVID-19. Experts do caution the human clinical trials are still underway and more data is needed. But today's news is fueling hopes a coronavirus vaccine could be within reach.
We see the light at the end of the tunnel. We are hopeful we are getting there because our scientists are working incredibly hard.
The Pfizer vaccine is one of 11 candidates in late-stage phase 3 trials. It enrolled nearly 44,000 participants in 6 countries and raised no safety concerns. Half the group received 2 doses of the vaccine. The other half got a placebo. 94 of the participants have developed COVID-19. It's believed most of them were in the placebo group. That does not mean this vaccine is approved for use yet. More work needs to be done, but no vaccine has gone from the drawing board to showing signs of promise in such a short period of time. Abigail Bimman has our top story tonight.
A great day for science. It is a great day for humanity.
Pfizer's CEO says he felt overwhelmed to learn of the 90% effectiveness rate.
I believe this is likely the most significant medical advance in the last 100 years.
We were thinking 50% would be okay, 9% is extraordinary. Keep in mind that the seasonal flu would get anywhere between 40 and 70% effectiveness.
Experts say we still need a lot more information. The trial isn't complete yet.
The side effect profile, we don't have long-term data, we don't have demographic data, so we certainly need to hear much more about this. But this is really the first that we've heard of some significant successes in a phase 3 clinical trial.
That's how we'll get through this winter to a spring and a summer that will be much better, I promise.
The Prime Minister stressing COVID precautions are key now when a vaccine can't help. And when it can, Canada has secured at least 20 million doses of the Pfizer vaccine.
Beginning distribution in Canada to high priority groups. That is most likely to happen in Q1 or in the first 3 months of 2021. But of course, there is a lot of uncertainty.
The United Kingdom and U.S. are talking about rollout before the end of this year. Canada isn't offering more specifics, but it is preparing. The Pfizer vaccine needs to be kept very cold.
We have minus 80-degree freezers, and we know how to make more minus 80-degree freezers, and we have the capacity to do this.
It also requires 2 doses.
With the number of vaccines that are still going through clinical trials, as well as those that are in preclinical development, we still have a real shot or a feasible shot of getting to a single-shot vaccine.
As for the Pfizer vaccine, it's now weeks away from FDA approval in the United States. But getting the emergency use authorization it's looking for won't be a green light for us in Canada. Health Canada will be making its own decision on this and any other vaccine. Donna?
Abigail Bimman in Ottawa, thank you. After so many gloomy months, today's promising news injected some optimism into the markets. Some of the big winners were travel companies and airlines. Air Canada's shares jumped more than 25%. American Airlines gained 15%. And cruise company Carnival saw its stock surge 39%. A vaccine isn't going to change where we're at right now, and case numbers along with hospitalizations are rising across much of the country. More than 4,000 new cases were reported in just 24 hours over the weekend. That is a record high. And today, Quebec reported more than 1,000 cases for a sixth straight day. 5 more people died there. There were more than 1,200 positive tests in Ontario today and 12 more deaths. Nunavut now has its second case. It's connected to the same household where the first case was identified on Friday. In the West, Alberta is reporting 644 new cases and 7 more people have died. In BC, 462 new cases reported in the past 24 hours and 5 more deaths. Apart from Atlantic Canada, the spread of the virus is ramping up fast. Each province is taking a different approach with restrictions, and the messaging can be confusing. We have coverage from across the country tonight, beginning with Mike Drolet in Toronto.
Life is slowly getting back to normal just outside of Toronto in Peel region. With so many people out and about, you'd never know it's the only region in Ontario considered to be in the red zone. Epidemiologists are bewildered.
It's like saying we have speed limits on the highway, but that speed limit is 300 miles per hour. So I think it's far too forgiving of spread of the disease, and it's not the right timing either. We have a crisis right now. We should be looking at closing things, not allowing things to stay open.
Lockdowns don't appear to be in Premier Doug Ford's playbook anymore. He says he's looking for a happy balance and that he's been bombarded by calls from business owners begging him to keep the province open.
We're the lowest in North America in any jurisdiction, so as much as we're seeing the numbers go up, we still have the lowest numbers for any large jurisdiction.
But on the other side of the ledger is the health argument. Any way you measure it, Ontario is in crisis. 2 days in a row with over 1,200 new cases and a surging 7-day average. And when compared to the worst day the province saw in April, Ontario's numbers have doubled. The stats point to 2 main problem areas: community spread and close contact. Testing hasn't increased, yet Ontario's positive test rate is at an alarming 5%. Politically, expert Meyer Semyatiki says it all adds up to Ford having a credibility problem.
I think it's bewildering why he's going in the direction that he is, and I think until he can explain to Ontarians why that route makes sense, I think it only further undermines his position.
Until then, Ontario is open for business.
I'm Heather Yourex-West in Alberta, where doctors are bracing for an onslaught of COVID-19 patients as the number of new infections continues to surge. Alberta's ICU capacity for COVID patients is already hovering around 50%, but that number is expected to rise.
I'm actually concerned that even the best case scenario involves a real strain on the healthcare system, and failure to get things under control quickly could really magnify that.
A month ago, Alberta was seeing about 250 new infections every day, but in just 4 weeks, that number has tripled, and Alberta's public health system is struggling to cope.
Contact tracing is very overwhelmed in Alberta, and now a lot of the contact tracing is being put on the shoulders of Albertans rather than the contact tracers.
To be blunt, all that we have accomplished together is now at risk.
On Friday, Alberta's premier said the rising case numbers need to be taken seriously, but the province stopped short of implementing any mandatory restrictions.
It's voluntary. This is a strong request that Albertans in Edmonton and Calgary stop holding social gatherings at their homes, that they just keep to their core family group at home, period.
I think if people truly stuck to what is recommended, then I think that we could see a decline, but I think what we're seeing is that that's not being done.
Instead, many on the front lines say it's time for the province to take more drastic action, a short, sharp period of lockdown to give the province's health system a chance to get things back under control.
We are essentially the canary in the coal mine in this kind of a situation, and we are telling the premier that we are concerned, and I don't feel our concerns are being listened to.
I'm Robin Gill in British Columbia, where a second wave of COVID-19 has brought in new restrictions. No gatherings at homes, no fitness classes, limited sports activities.
Over the next 2 weeks, we need to reduce our social contacts and we need to make sure that we're staying local.
Restaurants in BC were told they're safe spots because so far there is no evidence of COVID-19 transmission.
Nothing changes because in restaurants, it's 6 or fewer people in bubbles that you trust. So they could be a work bubble, they could be a volunteer bubble, they could be your immediate household bubble.
The new rules needed some clarification, though. At first, only members of an immediate household could get together. The messaging changed to include the people you spend the most time with.
This latest action in our COVID-19 response is about putting the brakes on the virus, breaking those chains of transmission. It is a short-term pause on non-essential activities.
The Metro Vancouver area has seen a disturbing and record-breaking spike in cases. Take this modeling done for the BC Centre for Disease Control. It's not a predictor, but shows where things are going. Yellow is the current growth. The other colors show what can happen if there's reduced contact.
If we do something great for 2 weeks, but then we return to what we've been doing in the past 3 weeks, the cases will just pick up again.
BC was the envy of the country at the beginning of this pandemic with its low cases. Not anymore. Robin Gill, Global News, Vancouver.
Manitoba's chief public health officer is considering tougher restrictions because COVID-19 keeps spreading there. Manitoba reported 365 new cases today and 3 more deaths, and the test positivity rate is 9.5%. The bulk of the new cases are in Winnipeg. The province is investigating outbreaks at 2 long-term care homes as well, where 36 residents have died. Hospital ICUs are nearing capacity.
We're at a critical point where we need to change these dynamics. And it all comes down to reducing our contacts.
The Atlantic bubble is holding for the most part. Nova Scotia reported 1 new case today, and it announced a clampdown on travel. Anyone arriving in Nova Scotia from outside the Atlantic travel bubble must now self-isolate for 14 days away from other family members. If that can't be done, then anyone living with that individual must isolate as well, and nobody from that household can go to work or school. Now, to the United States, the numbers are staggering there. Nearly 10 million people are known to have had COVID-19, and more than 237,000 Americans have died. New data out today shows 43 U.S. states are reporting at least a 10% rise in cases compared to last week. Tonight, hospitals in 22 states have record high hospitalizations, and America's 7-day average has also hit a record with more than 100,000 new cases reported every 24 hours in the past week. A new president and a new plan to combat COVID-19. Coming up, what Joe Biden wants everyone in the U.S. to do. And life in the fast lane, the potential future of transportation.
I want to congratulate President-elect Biden and Vice President-elect Harris. I'm looking forward to working with them both on the common challenges and opportunities facing our countries and our world.
Prime Minister Justin Trudeau was the first world leader to speak with the President-elect of the United States, Joe Biden, in a phone call earlier today. COVID-19 was top of the agenda. Biden has moved his transition plans into high gear, and the man who remains president until January is still refusing to concede. Jackson Proskow reports.
72 days before his inauguration, Joe Biden laid out his plans for day one on the job.
I will be a president for every American. This election is over.
With the pandemic now surging beyond control in most states, Biden has already established a panel of expert advisors, like Dr. Rick Bright, the whistleblower fired by the Trump administration. The president-elect is also making a national plea for all Americans to wear masks immediately.
We could save tens of thousands of lives if everyone would just wear a mask for the next few months.
The normally staid process of presidential transition has been upended by an outgoing president who refuses to concede.
The practice in recent years has been a pretty strong norm that the outgoing administration does what it can to facilitate and smooth the way for the new administration to come in.
Instead, Donald Trump has spent his days falsely insisting the election was stolen, while his campaign continues making unproven claims of widespread voter fraud. State officials who ran the election, even Republican ones, say it's just not true.
We know the system counted properly. We know the ballots that were there were counted properly and correctly. We know that.
Most of the court challenges launched by the Trump campaign have already been dismissed for lack of evidence. Still, Trump's Republican backers in Washington are standing by him for now, cutting him a wide berth to make baseless accusations about the vote.
The president has every right to look into allegations and to request recounts under the law.
While all this plays out, President Trump remains largely hidden from public view. But in a tweet, he announced the sudden firing of the Secretary of Defense, raising fears he might undertake a broader purge of government before his own exit in January. Donna?
All right, Jackson Proskow in Washington, thanks. Still ahead, Ottawa's slow progress on faster internet for rural Canadians.
Yes!
Those are the first passengers on the Virgin Hyperloop that had a test run in Las Vegas, hurtling them down a vacuum tube at high speed. It's hoped it could one day revolutionize high-speed travel. The electronic transport system uses magnetic levitation technology to propel pods at speeds of up to 1,000 kilometers an hour. It still needs more testing before it gets certified as safe. Looping Canada's rural communities into high-speed internet service is taking far longer than expected. Because so many people are working from home now, fast and reliable internet service is more vital than ever. Today, Ottawa promised to spend an additional $750 million to extend broadband service to remote areas. But it is a promise that has been made before, as Mike Le Couteur reports.
Good, reliable internet isn't a luxury. It's a basic service.
By that measure, remote communities have been deprived for years. According to Canada's radio, television and telecommunications regulator, nearly 41% of homes in rural areas have access to high-speed broadband internet. As a whole, over 85% of Canadians do. The newly announced $1.75 billion Universal Broadband Fund hopes to close that gap.
That's going to provide every community across this country who's got shovel-ready projects ready to go with an opportunity to apply and get connected within the next year.
The goal is to get 98% of Canadian homes connected to high-speed internet by the year 2026. High-speed internet is defined as 50 megabit per second download speed and 10 megabit upload speed. And the pandemic has exposed Canada's digital divide.
There are people that can't work from home. They can't actually do their education from home. They don't have the option of having a video conference with their doctor for a prescription, but have to go into the office.
Consecutive governments have made similar broadband promises all the way back to 2008. Monday's announcement was made 18 months ago by the Liberals, and opposition parties say the government is dragging its feet.
What we're hearing from a lot of smaller internet service providers is that they've already lost this year, and they're not going to be able to get shovels in the ground until some point next year after the winter.
And that could delay the plan to have high-speed internet in every home by the year 2030. Mike Le Couteur, Global News, Ottawa.
Next, the Canadian who returned from the First World War only to face the grief of a pandemic. Remembrance Day is going to look different this year. People won't be able to gather the way they usually do, but families across this country will still honor those who fought and never came home. More than a century ago, it was not only the First World War that led to millions of deaths, but a flu pandemic. And for some families, it was a double blow. Redmond Shannon has the story of one of those families.
So this is a picture of James and Ellen taken in 1916.
Genealogist Eunice Robinson lives in the past, unlike her husband Barry.
My husband is the original non-gen, and the non-gen is the term I coined to say somebody who could absolutely care less about genealogy.
But exploring Barry's family history is one of the most interesting projects she's worked on. In 1907, his great-grandfather James Baird Brown left Scotland with his wife and children to start a new life in Winnipeg. 7 years later, war broke out and their sons James Jr. and George enlisted with Canada's 44th Battalion. Their father, then 53, wanted to fight too, so he lied about his age, saying he was 43.
You hear about the youngers often saying they're older, but rarely do you hear about the older saying that they're younger. So I guess he felt extremely patriotic. I believe when he finally got to England, they thought, hey, you're too old, fella. So they put him to work in the quartermaster's office, where I guess he did quite a good job.
In October 1916, George was killed in battle, one of the more than 24,000 Canadian deaths in the brutal and infamous Somme offensive. George is buried at the Adanac Military Cemetery in northern France. Before the war was over, James Sr., by then aged 55, was discharged for being overage and returned to Winnipeg. Just weeks after the war ended, James Jr. married a British war bride, tying the knot at this church in London.
Around that time, James Sr. returned to Europe to find his younger son's grave. While in London, he most likely stayed on this street at James Jr.'s home. But he contracted influenza during the Spanish flu pandemic that was killing millions, and he died, aged 56.
Who can envision what the world would have been like with a previous pandemic? And this has really brought it home, and you kind of wonder where you really are, maybe put in a position where you have no control over getting this disease.
James Jr. returned to Winnipeg 2 years later. He died there in 1953, taking with him the answer to a mystery about his dad's final journey to Europe.
I don't really know if he ever found George's graveyard. That was done under the Canadian War Graves Commission, so a good chance that he may not have. I don't really know all those answers, and unfortunately, I don't think there's anyone living that still does.
Perhaps it's enough to know that James Sr. paid the ultimate price trying to find his son's final resting place. Redmond Shannon, Global News, London.
And that is Global National for this Monday. I'm Donna Friesen. Tonight here in Canada is the sun starting to set over Vancouver. Thanks for watching. Hope to see you here again tomorrow. Take care of yourselves. Bye-bye.